Hello, selectors, and welcome back to the Life First podcast. I'm doing the tier list a little late, in this thing. We did holding this off a little bit until the GP, just because thought the GP would shake out some things, and we'd see how some of this different tiers would land. But this is the virtuals tier list, like where the Elrigs lay on CP01, at least in my opinion. Again, this is not exactly the meta that we're going to see in the GP. This is actually from a lot of my testing for what seems to work. There are decks that are going to be good and are going to win higher on the GP, for example, than what I rate them. And I don't necessarily think that means they're the greatest deck in the world. I just think that means they can go hot, or that they have certain things that let them, maybe luck with the draw of who they played against during their 7 rounds, that let them get sort of like a higher ranking. But basically, I've also changed up the tier listing things. It used to be more like, oh yeah, these have the following deck constructions, and because of that, they do better. But I've changed this to being just like a little bit more based on win rate and what I've tested with. So S tier basically says it beats everything. It's got an above 50% win rate against literally every deck in the format. And then an A tier is like a pretty healthy win rate across the board. It's got a 45, so it either barely loses or solidly wins basically across the board. And I think that there's a couple things in that format here. B is where it starts getting a little bit different. B is where I want to take the decks that are solidly performing, but not at the high enough rating, or they have lopsided matchups. Like they win really well against certain matchups and then lose against certain other matchups, which means that they are a less consistent version of A tier. But that means that these B tier things can still take events, just assuming that they've got the right like sort of round setups. C is above average decks and solid decks. Like these are things that are specifically like they're good decks, but they're kind of missing a piece or two to make them, this A tier type of deck. And then D is kind of a new thing that I'm doing here with this. These are the ones that I think these are fine decks, and if they hit the right bursts, or if they hit the right order of cards, or they hit the right combo of things, the synergies, they could take entire events. But needs significant amount of luck to really get them there. And then F is untiered. I've already done this one. I don't want to argue these ones. I know people will come back and say, well, real as a if you do it in mono red thing, this could be, all the way up here, but really it's these mostly will land here. And of course, these aren't the ones that are coming up for the next set, which is the Desona set. I'll get more of these added in here at then. Let's just go with this. I stole a lot of these images from a different tier list. I think I include, credit here to the person who pulled these images in the first place for me. So we're starting out fresh here with the Tama deck, right? And now, granted, I'm going to talk a lot about these centers. It's the archetypes that are good, not necessarily the centers. But having these archetypes exist with these centers as being an example, I think are pretty strong. If I need to split them out, like I will have like, these multiple centers to split them out a little bit. Anyways, let's start with Tama. So Tama is a very strong, Tama Clear specifically is what I'm talking about here. This is a very strong deck that's got a 45 to 55% win rate across the meta. It is a little worse against the discard decks than it used to be. I think a lot of people have learned how to play around Over Pursuit, and I think a lot of people have learned how to play around Umir Clear. Assuming that, you're an opponent who knows how to play around those two things specifically, you might lower this win rate to 45. However, you're going to have a lot of opponents that aren't good at that type of thing, which is going to push your win rate up to 55%. So I think Tama Clear is still solidly an A tier deck, and I think it's going to stick here for a while. Hirana Dash is the one that's the Hirana deck that I'm going to choose for this. And I think it's solidly a B tier deck. It has games where it just wins, and it's awesome when it does that. It is got a potential to self-implode on itself, but if you hit the right things, you can just straight up win stuff. I mean, it did get top 8 in this GP. It went really hot, and then kaputted a little bit on itself for, I think, top 8, although I didn't watch that matchup, so I don't really know. But that does seem like the Dash Hirana, normal thing that happens with it. There's another Tama here, and I don't need it, so I'm just going to pull that aside. Wolf, I think Wolf needs a lot of luck to win. I think it's kind of like a Ooh, it's kind of like this combo deck where it sort of puts out a lot of damage out of nowhere and gains a lot of enter out of nowhere. But I think it can do well. It just needs a lot of luck to win. I'm also gonna put a I'm gonna put the Musica deck in there. So Musica has this interesting ability of being able to bounce your own level 2 assist to your hand and then do kind of things. It's inflexible in its approach, but what it does is strong, so it's worth mentioning that it is above, F tier. It does exist. I don't like the inflexibility of it, so I put it down in D tier. Then we've got Yuzuki. I think Yuzuki is a fine deck, but not like great. It does some interesting things. Enter Burn is just not really where I want to be in this meta. I want to be at Strangling Enter with stuff like Tama or Mono White. Red doesn't really offer anything that Mono White right now doesn't already give, and when you add red as a center, it doesn't really mesh well with the other colors too. So I want to put this here. It theoretically could go here, but I think I'm going to play it safe and put it in the needs luck to win. I'm being a little bit more stringent with with my tiering setups here now, because I want to be more specific about these archetypes are the strong and winning one. Plus, I have so much testing with the GP with right now that I genuinely think that I can be pretty decisive about these things. So we bring in the combo that is the card jockey combo. I like card jockey here. I'm not actually listing these in terms of like what's better. I mean, if I would, probably card jockey would go a little higher up than some of these other ones. But I like card jockey's combo. It's a lot of safe damage, and that's something I learned a lot during this GP and the testing up to this GP. Is what is safe damage. I'm gonna have a whole podcast on it at some point. But being that it's Elrig attacks, it's very safe damage. It's very good to go after. So I like card jockey, but not enough to say, yeah, it's got the consistency to be a solid deck anymore. Then I've got Deus. This is going to be Deus Adams here. I think Deus Adams is great. Specifically, I'm going to put Deus Adams before Hirana Dash Hirana. I'm going to tier these a little bit in order, but these I'm not going to see in below. So Deus Adams, and while I'm grabbing it, I really should just grab this one as well. This is going to be my remember, but like Adams remember thing here. That's H2O chilling. I like both of these almost equally amount, but they have different lopsided matchups as to why they would be better versus the other. Let's just go ahead and put yeah, I'm gonna do this. I'm just gonna leave it there. So Deus Adams is really good against the white aggro decks, and Remember Adams are really good against the Esper decks. So I think depending on your meta, you could pick which one you'd want as a center, and I probably would lean more towards Remember as the option, unless you're in that mono white meta, and I think we are closer to a mono white meta right now. So Deus gets the nudge ahead of Atomic Remember. That being said, I think they're pretty equal in power level. Musica, I think it is worth mentioning that Musica comes up here in A tier. I think, in fact, it goes over here. So I've got to talk to Pigeon still a little bit, but Pigeon, I think, wasn't super comfortable with running this, even though it did win the oh god, what do you call it, the GP. But this deck, along with Remember, I'm gonna nudge Remember above Musica. This is my Madoka. This is my preference here. This is my list, so I can set it up the way I think it is. I genuinely think that Remember Esper is better than Madoka Esper, but only by like a fraction of a point. Like they are still insanely close. I think this Remember gets a little bit more board damage consistently, whereas this does a little bit of better job being defensive against the aggro decks and out card draws the Esper mirror with stuff like Firefly Squid, for example. So I think they're very close. They're slightly different Esper control decks that do the job. And I think these are very good. Now, the interesting thing here is that I don't have an Anj in here. Whoops. I just added them. Okay. Back to the business. there are these all three of these decks and the fourth mystery one have gotten close to being a 50 to 55% beats everything rating, but not quite, right? So the Remember deck is a little less weak against aggro, because it's got more Exius, basically, is the answer to that question. Um, but it is a little bit more weak to Tama, because it draws a little bit less, so it gets a little bit less guards, in my opinion, than this one does, whereas this one's a little bit more weak to Anj. So there's just enough aggro that could keep these two decks from being overwhelmingly good, that they go in the S tier over here. But it's barely. It's barely. I don't think there. Spoilers. There's going to be no deck going into S tier right now. There just isn't anything that flat out beats everything in the meta. Just doesn't exist right now. Moving right along, there is a Senga deck, and it is not awful, but it's not great. And it does a job, which is that it basically draws you cards and gets you enter. It's good enough to put yourself in D tier. Same thing with the Tamago deck. The Tamago deck is just basically a worse Esper, right? At its best, it is a little too reactive and a little too slow. It does the job that these guys that these Remember, or these Espers do, which is shred the opponent's hand better than they do, but it doesn't actually win the game. Whereas these two, generally speaking, win the game a little bit better than them. So that's why that's going to go in there. And while we're there, we might as well grab this Pyrluke and the Pyrluke Alios Pyrluke, because these are all basically the same deck. They really efficiently discard your hand, but they don't quite have enough ways to move into damage. In order to do that, you move away from control and you make them more mid range, and then they just end up being fine decks. They don't end up being like fantastic. I suppose you could make an argument to put these two up here. I think that would be a fine argument to make. In fact, I like this one maybe a little bit better than this one, so maybe if you put that in the C tier here. Um, we've got Nova. Nova has actually done a little bit of a better job than it used to. It is now in the D tier still, because Nova's 2.0 does a really good job at recurring Oodles. And Oodles is actually a pretty good card. Once you have the Oodles combo going, it's actually kind of hard to stop recurring the Oodle combo. So I like Nova in that front. However, it still suffers the same thing that Nova always suffered, which is just not really a ton of damage output outside of the Oodles stuff. So I'm going to leave it here in D tier. I actually like this deck quite a bit, enough to push it into C tier. This deck is a green and black deck. II is what it's called. It's got enough ways to push damage that I think it ends up being pretty good in where you need it to be. It's got this I win button where it can do, just like Dash Hirana can do, it can just do like 8 damage in a turn, which is pretty crazy. And you can actually, unlike Dash, you can break that damage up over multiple turns to make it more lethal if you want to do more safe damage. And I like that about it. However, being green, it ends up with the green tax, which is there's just not a lot of good green cards. So the bulk of your deck is made up of solid but average cards, and because of that, it's just not where you want to be at. Here we've got another Remember, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put that down here because I think this is for Blue Remember, which we don't have yet. Or maybe this is for Blue Remember that we don't have yet. Whatever. It does not matter too much. Let's go ahead and just take out this atomic thing and put in Remember here. So there's the atomic Remembers. The next one is X. Now, I still like X. X still goes into the B tier for me. In fact, it's just right under Dash Hirana. It's a more consistent against things. However, I just think its win rate is not quite high enough across the board. It has some matchups where it's really good. Actually, it's quite strong against the Esper matchup itself. But if the Esper matchup knows how to mitigate the damage output that you're doing to try to trap you in a corner, then X as a team, DXM, suffers a bit because of that. Without that, it also still has some worse matchups that it just kind of auto loses to. So it ends up being in B tier. Otherwise, if it didn't have those auto lose matchups, I actually would put it in the end of A tier. But it's got those sort of like matchups that it's not super great against. Then we have Umir. So Umir is an interesting one. I'm gonna put it in C tier. I know I got top 4, but it is still, every time I've played Umir, it can kind of really fall apart. You either make it good versus aggro and it falls apart versus Esper, or good versus Esper and it falls apart against aggro. That ends up being pretty lopsided with things. And it's not quite like here where it's like lopsided one way or another and you're really strongly winning the games that you're winning. The games that you're winning, even when you have your more lopsided matchups, it's more lopsided on the losing end, I think. It's solid otherwise, but then there are some matchups that really, depending on how you build it, it's just tough. This deck really wants a ton of different level 3s in order to make it work, and it's just, it wants time, and in this meta isn't kind to decks that want time right now. So I'm going to leave it in C tier. I know that potentially it should maybe be bottom of B tier, but my gut tells me put it here. And again, I'm just gonna go with this is my opinions. I'm gonna make opinions, and it's gonna be controversial, I guess. Mew, I think it goes into D tier. Mew just ends up being a worse Esper deck or a worse like white black deck. It opens lanes, it does damage. It only opens up small lanes. It doesn't really do a great job at being flexible like Remember does. Or Madoka. It doesn't really get you that hand cycling that you need to really make it great. So it ends up being this weird tragic thing where it can open up a lane, which these guys struggle a little bit with, but you also can play around it. I mean, the opponent can put a 3-2-2 field and get around it pretty easily. So I don't know. Not super fantastic here. It's also kind of tragic because black is just an extremely good support color and not necessarily a good main deck color. As you can see, like basically nothing is black up here with the exception of Deus. And Deus has one of those strange times where it can filter, right? It can pull out a lot of cards from your trash and put them into play. So it has the filtering ability. We don't have green Yuzuki. I'm going to put that back here. We don't have that one, whatever that is. Aya. Okay. Aya is kind of sad for me. I think it was here a couple sets ago, and then it was here maybe a couple sets ago, and then upon the release of Virtuals, I think it is probably here. I don't think Aya is that great anymore. Basically, anyone who knows how to keep cards in their hand will win against Aya. That's sort of what my testing has shown. There are ways to make it work. I don't think it's strong outside of that, which is tragic. I genuinely like this tempo deck, so that's why I'm like spending so much time on it. It's heartbreaking for me. But I tested it pretty hard for the GP and just could not get it to function. I think it has some matchups. It actually wins pretty well against Tama. Like it has like a 60-70% against Tama clear as a deck, which is kind of insane to think about. But then pretty much everything else, it's pretty rock bottom. It is very bad against aggro as well. I just don't think it quite get there. I think maybe in a world of Blue Archive when that comes out at some point, and white blue gets really good tempo support cards, it could maybe go back up. But for now, I'm putting it in the D tier. I think it needs luck to win. It can still win. I just think it needs luck. Mel, on the other hand, Mel goes into B tier. I actually think it's quite strong. Oh wait, no. I did have Umir. I'm looking at my cheaty notes. I did have Umir in B tier, so I'm gonna put it back there. But I put it under Mel. Mel is a pretty good deck. I think it has a strong 40% win rate against the entire meta. Especially if you build it as a mid-range deck. It just isn't vulnerable to a lot of the things that people are restricting resources, right? This restricts card resources. This restricts enter resources. This does like lane opening, right? So I think it's pretty good against all of them, but doesn't beat any of them in particular. You can maybe set it up to beat one of these more particularly than others at the cost of the others like win rate, but then you end up in that lopsided scenario that we were talking about. I like Mel. I think it's a strong thing. I like that it has a lot of versatility in its souls, in its accessories. That's actually something I like more than these guys do. So I like Mel here where it's at. I think it's a strong green deck. I think it's underrepresented. I think people should play it more. Okay, so I'm gonna take this. What is her name? Eldora. I'm put her in the D tier. She is fine. She's fine. You can put her in an Adams build, or you can put her in a build that has really strong life bursts, and she ends up being fine. Her assist is nuts. It's coming out next set, so that's one to keep an eye on. But her actual Elrig itself is not really anything to write home about. Maybe it will be. Depends on it. See, here's the thing. The cool thing with this is its power level doesn't necessarily get power crept out over time. It really just depends on how good the life bursts are that it can use to its advantage. It actually goes up if the life bursts suddenly get better. So it's the dream's not over at all. But it's for now. I don't think it's that great. Remember is also going to go into my D tier. Again, these aren't necessarily in order. With maybe Aya actually being the top there. I'm gonna put down Carnival as D tier as well. I've been testing it out a lot. I really want it to work. I never got it to do its thing. You can either play it as an aggro deck, and you can be very borderline with it as an aggro deck, or you can play it as a control deck, where you play it as more of like a white mid-range deck, I guess is the correct term. Either way, the mid-ranger deck asks for multiple turns to happen, and also asks for some cool red cards that are more mid-rangey, and those don't really exist because they're all very aggressive. So she fails in that front. And then as the aggro deck, she's fine, but she doesn't give you anything that I don't think you can't get with X. So that's why she ends up being lower on that front. Kazuko is actually a deck I like, but not a ton. It's basically it's able to do a lot of negative effects and also use its trash as a toolbox. Both those things I like. But spoiler, Toko exists now. And I like Toko better. In fact, I'm gonna put Toko over in C tier. This is gonna make one of my locals very, very happy. He's actually the top winning Toko player. And I was actually really impressed to see what Toko could do. It's not like the best virtual deck by any stretch, I don't think, but I think it does Gozuko's job a little bit better than she does. So I like her at C. I think as an Elrig herself, her center Elrig, she could just go into slot into anything basically, and you can get advantage out of the negative 8,000s she can throw around. So I like her quite a bit. Then we've got Sachet. So Sachet is also one of the decks that got top 4, and it also got top 2 actually. It also got top a couple, I think maybe 2 top 16 spots. So it's a good deck. It's a good deck. But I've tested a lot of my own, and I don't love it. I like it a lot. I don't love it, but I do like it a lot. So it ends up being in top of B tier in my opinion. So here's why. I actually like, and I'm gonna get someone upset with when I say this, I like Tama better. Tama feels like it does what Sachet does, but just more proactively. And in Wixoss, I pretty much always give the pass on the more proactive strategies than the reactive strategies. There are scenarios as Sachet where just the game falls apart on you, and you don't have really a clear-cut way to victory. If the opponent is managing your resources correctly, and I mean like is getting rid of your hand as well as getting rid of your enter, it can feel miserable being a Sachet player. Sachet is good against aggro. It's fantastic against aggro. But these guys are less good, but can do kind of the same job as them. All they need to do is put out Exias or other things that can't get lane opened, and it does a similar job as Sachet. Sachet is just its bounce of 3 costs just a little bit too much, and its hand is really, really affected by the opponent. As such, it can kind of get pushed out, I think, by all 3 of these that are in the top decks here, plus maybe not. But these 3 specifically can push it out of there, and because of that, I'm putting it top of B tier. There's an argument that you can make that it is bottom of A tier, for sure. I just think because of the lopsided matchup it has against specifically the Esper decks, that I think you end up in top of B tier. It's a fantastic deck. I think it's going to continue being very good. Wixoss wants to open up lanes a lot, and I think Sachet is going to stay there. We don't have this one. Cool. Milaloon. Okay, so here's where I'm going to be, again, a person, and I think people are going to come for me on this. I think Milaloon is about here in the B tier. It also made top 4. I'm not I'm not pooping on Milaloon here. I'm gonna be honest with you here. Everything that's in B tier is stuff I would consider bringing to the GP, or things I tested for the GP. I think every single one of these decks are fantastic. So when I put when I put this in here, even though it did end up in top 4, it is not to besmirch Milaloon. I think Milaloon is a good deck. I also think there are ways to beat it that if you play it against it over and over and over and over again, you find those play patterns. But people who don't are going to be shocked by how of insane this deck functions. This deck plays differently than any other Wixoss deck. It's an engine. The entire deck and the card draw is an engine. In fact, the reason why I think II is down here is straight up because Milaloon is a better center than it. Milaloon deck does everything that II does, just better. It doesn't enter starve. Sure, that's something it board clears. So it gets more damage than the the Aya deck does. But it also does the thing that Aya does, which is draw a ton of cards, and thus you have guards in your hand, and you never get discarded out. It is great at these things, but it has just more interaction pushed in. The discard is more effective because you're vanishing stuff every turn, and the games are more effective because you're winning before the opponent is able to recover. So because of that, I think Milaloon ends up getting the nudge over here to pop itself into B tier. I think it's a very, very strong deck. The thing that I don't like about it is that some decks, like for example, Clear, are able to just sort of ignore the discard that the Milaloon player is doing, and during that time also use the enter that it's being provided to do a lot of damage on the crackback. The reason why Clear is so strong and is worthy of A tier is because it can ignore discard up until basically turn 5. Afterwards, it becomes very vulnerable to discard. But Milaloon isn't trying to be a long game deck, and as such, it ends up losing to Tama. It also ends up losing to both these two decks in specifically, in my opinion, because these two decks are able to recover their hand at just a way, way, way higher rate than the rest of these decks can. So the discard is just less effective on them. Plus, they have ways to shut down lanes, so they theoretically can also deal with that kind of approach as well, which puts this solidly in B tier, in my opinion. Now, I have a Kentucky here. Kentucky is not an Elric. It is a vibe. It's a vibe, guys. And the vibe is that I actually think it goes over here. I was testing a lot, and a video will come out soon to show you some of the decks that I was testing for GP, and I was actually hoping would work out, but didn't work out, that I thought were the best decks that could be meta stompers, right? Meta crackers. I don't think they're necessarily the best decks in the format, but I do think that they have a lopsided win rate enough that they theoretically could have stomped the meta if the meta was a different meta. And one of the decks that I was heavily testing was a Remember Center that was basically a red black mid range deck. It basically took all of the damage clocking that X has, but taking out X so that way I had card filtering that Remember does. And it ended up there's two different versions that I ran. One was an Oodles version, which was less good, versus this version, which is the Kentucky version, which I think was better. It ended up being so. It was really good at presenting a clock, and it was really good at doing damage, but it wasn't really good at being flexible, which is something I wanted in my GP deck. So, as such, I think it's one of these solid decks that can just take a whole thing, and I think are constantly strong, but maybe not just the best deck that you could possibly be playing. So I wanted to put it in the C tier here. Granted, yes, I understand that the B tier and the D tier are basically, the C tier is the transitionary one. It's the ones that I think are just good enough to escape this realm while not being quite good enough to be in the top tier. To put it in perspective, these are all decks that I maintain personally because I think they just have genuine shots at winning locals all the time when I play them. This one, I don't have as much faith in that. I think it can win locals, and I think if people are like dedicated to this archetype, then great, you should play it. It's a strong deck. The rest here, there's only a couple more left here. We've got our virtuals that I haven't talked about yet, and then the rest are just Elrics that were added to this. We've got Mito. I don't like Mito. but that's not to say Mito's a bad deck. I actually think Mito is a fine deck. I would put it here. Oh, Adolfo. I didn't put that one in there right either. Alpho, I guess is what her name is. So it is worth mentioning Alpho at the same time that I'm talking about Mito. I actually think Alpho probably goes here. This deck is fine, and this is basically this deck, but worse. So Mito goes there. Mito mills yourself as well as milling the 10 cards, and because of that, both these end up in best when they're played as a virtual deck, where they refresh the opponent twice. Basically, you say mill 8, and also you're playing Urith Scare, so you're milling 8, 16 total, which is enough to refresh someone. So between when you mill them 16, they refresh the first time, and then that's when you pull out the other virtual uh, piece that mills them completely out. So then you basically refresh them twice. That is some strong power. However, if you were to play an Exia against these decks, you really just slow down their aggro approach. That's all they have. That their power kind of pomps after that. However, it's a very, very real threat, and that's why I'm putting it in C tier here. Whereas with Mito, by opening yourself up to also being counter milled, it means that these types of decks can refresh you, and that by putting yourself weakness there, you actually lose the race that you were winning because of the double refresh. So I like Alpha a lot more than I like Mito in that scenario. Um, the next one is our last two virtuals. So Ange, or not Ange, Liz is fine. I actually am going to put it at F tier. Sorry, I don't love it. This meta is like, hello, I really want to enter Starview, and this center costs enter to guard, so it just doesn't do well against aggro. It can do fine against red aggro, I suppose. But against other trashing aggros, it's just not great. And it's once per game, which allows you to dig pretty deep, 5 cards, and you have to take a card out of it and put it directly to field. That is actually a negative. Putting it directly to field, generally speaking, negative. Because you can't really set yourself up for success there. There's sometimes you're going to want for example, the Yuki, but you want to do the Yuki after, and you don't know what's on the top 5, so you'd rather put that to hand. There's also some scenarios where you're going to end up being in a weird limit scenario with it. It's just this is a lot. The Shadow is good. I like the Shadow. The Shadow is seriously a underappreciated mechanic. Shouts out to Akino being right next to it and also having that. But in this meta, it's just the paying for the guards, especially if the opponent then puts out a Remember Memoria. You were just in a scenario where you just can't pay all that tax, so it ends up being very bad for you. Ange, A tier, bottom of A tier in my opinion. So here's the truth about Ange. This is why I saved it for last. I really, 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 really was almost on Ange for the GP. I switched 2 weeks before the GP, to my detriment for what it's worth. I think if I had an extra week working with Remember, I would have probably made top 8. I switched to Ange, or from Ange, the very last second. And my reasoning is, I genuinely thought Ange was up here. Not necessarily the version that everyone's playing, but my version that I made with Pigeon. I thought it solved some of the issues that I had with Ange. And because of that, I thought it pushed the win rate from 50% to 55-ish on the matchups I thought were not great. And because of that, I thought I could win against everything. It ends up being just a solid deck. The reason being is Ange struggles to filter appropriately, which seems insane to say, because you've got all these virtual things that filter for you. You got Himawari's, you've got Chigasas, you've got both pieces, right? If you use Lazulite Flash, and I am a fan of Lazulite Flash for Ange more than I am a fan of the mill, but that's just a me thing. I think it gives you better long game potential, and it gives you a more solid, I'm ending the game. It gives you a little less explosion, but it gives you a more solid way to win the game when you're getting resource denied a bit. I think that Ange has a 45 to 55 win rate across the entire field, and because of that, I think Ange can win dramatically sometimes. The issue that I was finding was, we're talking hundreds of games with here. I have found hundreds of games, overwhelmingly, if the opponent bursts a 50% stop your damage burst on turn 1 or turn 2, your win rate drops significantly. Like if your opponent hits a burst on their turn 1 and their turn 2 and it stops at least 1 damage on both of those, your win rate turns abysmal. Like we're talking 20% chance to win after that. And that's why I ended up thinking these two were just way better. Is because these basically, if they don't burst well against Ange, they lose the game. They straight up lose the game. It's a flip end for them. However, things are stacked slightly in their favor. When you are doing your mulligans, you are often getting rid of things that have bursts, so that way you pack your life burst with it. Basically, the rough math ends up being that your burst chance for your first burst is about 50%, and then your second burst is around, I think it was 82%, something like that. Maybe it's 76%. It's somewhere in that range. Either way, it basically means that the odds are in your favor that you will burst against Ange at least a little bit, you know. And because of that, it ends up being that the win rate against Esper, when an Esper player is playing their deck correctly and not making any mistakes, and I'm going to give some wiggle room for people to not know how to do this and make mistakes because it is a difficult matchup. The Esper win rate is 55% against Ange. As such, it ends up being back here. I often also found that Tama beats it. Tama can beat it when Tama is using their Umir aggressively. Umir clear aggressively against an Ange player often takes away the one chance they have at getting guards, which is the early game mulligan, plus whatever their Elrig that it is that draws them cards deeper, plus assuming a turn 1 Pandora. That clear hurts a lot in the race between these two. Not to mention, Tama also gets the benefit of just finding more guards naturally and finding Exias more naturally than the Ange deck does. It's still incredibly tight, but I do think that Tama, when doing their job correctly against Ange, has a 55% win rate, which is why I put Ange here. I genuinely 2 weeks before the GP, this is what it looked like for me, and then after those hundreds and hundreds of games, it's just here now. And I can say this with confidence because Tiffany plays Tama. She got the highest Tama clear deck in the GP, so she's a very incredible Tama player. Pigeon was an incredible Madoka player who I play tested a lot, and a lot of my friends' groups who are playing Esper play Remember, and I found the same deal. So this ends up being the final tier list, in my opinion. Tell me how you guys think about it, what you guys think is good or bad, whether you guys agree with some stuff or not. Let me know in the comments down below. You can roast me based on what you think is genuinely good. I'm super underrating if you want. I'm just being like a pretty particular with this go around because I'm trying to make it so these tier lists are a little bit more in depth, which is why they're longer right now, but also more like cutting teeth on exactly what is the best cards.